And we're really grateful again to have you join us, and it's going to be a lovely session, and we're really grateful for all the support and all the lovely people that we've met. And yes, have a lovely day. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. As I did last week, I thought I would make sure that I gave a couple shout outs to people who have made a big impact on the week. Warren, Catherine, Giannis, Sandy, Michael, Nancy, Imani, Crystal, Richard, Carrie, Don, I'm going to come back to you, Don, John, Beverly, Jennifer, and the whole team at SSBA America, Dwayne, and Mark Moiser, an amazing guy. And if you haven't checked out his videos, please do. He is a constitutional lawyer in California. I was introduced to him through Stacy Michaels, and I have really been impressed with his material and the work he's doing. So check out Mark if you have a chance on Facebook. I told you I was going to come back to this one. I want to come back to Don for a second. Just a little bit of disclaimer. And by the way, if there is ever a video that I make that should go to millions of people, and it's going to count on each one of you to make this happen, this is the one. Because at the end of this video, I am going to be giving you an opportunity to actually do something which you can do, number one, for free, and number two, to start taking action, to stand up against all of the tyranny that's happening. So do not wait to the, don't jump out of the video till you get to the end, because I'm giving you the way that we as a people can rise up against what's happening. So please stay through the video for this, and make sure of all the videos that I've produced, this is the one that if we make it go viral, and more importantly, if we act on it, this is the one that is going to take us over the top. So, and you got the title of it on the media. It was called Informed Consent, You Are a Lab Rat. And the reason I came up with this was I got an interesting message from Don. He's a guy who packs sardines. Now, little disclaimer, I have never in my life understood sardines. I don't like sardines. I am not a sardine fan. And I never actually thought I'd have a reason to talk about sardines on any application of anything, anywhere. But Don sent me a bunch of messages about what's happening with the opening of the sardine packing plants in California. And he was talking about all the challenges that they're facing with respect to all of the distancing and all of the masking and all the kinds of stuff that actually are a conflict for a lot of people. But he was sharing that with me, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to look into some things, because I'm sick and tired of people like Don and other millions of Americans working hard who are actually being subjected to capricious and arbitrary rulings by governors who have never lifted their hands in labor ever. Ever. And it's time that we people who actually know what it feels like to be standing in the mud and to work with our hands and to work in real jobs around the country, it's time that somebody actually looks after us. So I asked the question. The question was, what's going on with this bizarre statement that you hear governors make and several people in the Public Health Administration make about, you know, we're not going to be able to lift the state of emergency until we have a vaccine or until we have a therapy. And that got me thinking, there must be a law that I haven't read, and that's a rare thing, because I try to stay on top of all federal statutes, not only in the U.S., but around the world. I actually try to read as much as I can, and I was quite troubled by the fact that I had never read the 21 Code of Federal Regulations with the precision that I should have. Now, I did read it, and for those of you who don't know, the 21 Code of Federal Regulations is the rules that govern the Food and Drug Administration. And those rules are set out for the guidelines of how we constitute what is safe and what is effective in medicine in the United States. Now, rules on informed consent, which is actually one of the early sections of the provisions of the Code of Federal Regulations that govern the FDA, say in section 50.20 that except as provided in 50.23 and 50.24, no investigator may involve a human being as a subject in research covered by these regulations unless the investigator has obtained the legally effective consent of the subject or the subject's legally authorized representative. And the funny thing is I read that in the past, but I actually never looked at references 50.23 and 50.24 until Don started sending me messages, and I was like, hold on a minute, there's an exception. Because I was under the impression, mistakenly, I was under the impression that after the Second World War, the world kind of got together and actually realized that it would be a bad idea to repeat what Nazi Germany did, where they actually did human experimentation without consent. And you're all familiar with the Nuremberg trials and the Declaration of Helsinki, which became the law in terms of the morality of medical research. But the problem with the Declaration of Helsinki and the problem with the trials in Nuremberg was that the United States and other countries specifically decided that while they wanted to punish the Germans for what they did during the Second World War, they wanted to keep a wiggle room out clause that allowed them to continue to do human experimentation on people without their consent. That sounds like the pot calling the kettle black, and that's the reason why it sounds like it, is because it's illegal, immoral, and unethical. But Section 50.23 and Section 50.24 gives, in 50.23, the Department of Defense an opportunity to waive all requirements of informed consent for anybody serving in the military, which means that if you are serving in the military or you're part of any of the branches of the armed services, you actually not only have no rights to informed consent, but it's worse than that. That sounds bad enough. What's worse than that is the Supreme Court, in a very famous case of the United States v. Stanley, decided that not only do you have no rights, but you have no redress either. Congress thankfully passed a law later, and I'm going to get to this law, that actually gave a tiny bit of room for people who have been severely harmed by federal government research without their consent, a way to get redress. But the law and the Supreme Court actually ruled that basically the Department of Defense can waive informed consent and can do basically anything they want to anybody in the military. 50.24 is more problematic, and this is the one that I was asleep at the switch on. It can be suspended in situations where the President of the Department of Health and Human Services declare an emergency. And I was sitting there going, well, hold on a minute. So why are all these people, why are all these governors keeping on saying something that sounds absolutely ludicrous? When they say that they want to keep their states closed until there's a therapy or a vaccination, I'm sitting there going, any smart human being who reads any science at all knows that safe and effective treatments take years, not months, to actually achieve. And then all of a sudden, I started going down the rabbit hole of 50.24, and I found something really problematic. What I found was a thing called CMCs. MCMs. CMCs, MCMs. So many acronyms these days. MCMs, medical countermeasures. And I want to read what the Federal Register has, and this is the law in the United States, that during declared emergencies, medical industry is exempted from liability. And you heard what I just said. If you declare an emergency, the current 1,379 trials on medical devices for diagnostics and therapeutics around coronavirus, every single one of those manufacturers, every single one of those individuals from the date of the declared emergency has immunity from any liability. They can literally poison you, they can literally kill you with their therapy, and there is no recourse in law courtesy of the exemption that's in 21 CFR. And I'm going to read exactly what it says. This actually is the language. Provides liability immunity to certain individuals and entities, covered persons, against any claim of loss caused by, arising out of, or relating to, or resulting from the manufacture, distribution, administration, or use of medical countermeasures, covered countermeasures, except for claims of willful misconduct as defined in the PrEP Act. In other words, the reason why governors are so dedicated to keeping up the illusion of a pandemic and the illusion of the state of emergency is because it turns out that any action taken under an emergency use authorization by the FDA, any action taken by any manufacturer for any research that they're doing, they get a get-out-of-jail-free card, and they can do anything that they want, and they have no immunity, or they have no liability. They have absolute immunity. For those of you who have the time to do it, I highly recommend Richardson's article, When Human Experimentation is Criminal. And I'm going to have the reference to that at the bottom of the video when you see this on YouTube. But it's a really important thing to look at. But there's a little tiny problem, and I told you there's going to be hope at the end of this very disappointing, very abysmal, very unfortunate set of facts. The hope is that under Section 50.24, Anthony Fauci and the CDC and all the criminal co-conspirators I've talked about before at the Department of Health and Human Services forgot to read a little tiny clause. And I love when people who are criminals forget to do the crime all the way. You know that happens, right? It's the guy who robs the bank and leaves his gloves in the bank, or it's the guy who leaves the murder weapon in the vehicle. Like all of those stupid things where you go, dude, you got all of the rest of the crime right. You forgot one thing. And the one thing they got wrong was for 50.24 to work, there has to be, and I quote, concurrence of a licensed physician who is a member of the or a consultant to the Institutional Review Board and who is not otherwise participating in the investigation. In other words, if there was going to be a clinical trial on any intervention for coronavirus, there had to be somebody not associated with any of the therapies. Ha ha! This, my friends, is where we enter into the rabbit hole of the fun, because you'll notice that every individual that is in the advisory program and every individual that has been active in stipulating the biggest of the clinical trials, which is called social distancing and face mask wearing, which is clinical research as a defined term under the FDA standard of clinical research, they screwed up by not having an independent institutional review board, which is required under the 50.24 waiver. In other words, they thought they were getting away with absolute immunity, but they screwed up because they kept the conspirators all in the room and forgot that they have to have somebody who is independent. Now, I have spent a long time trying to figure out how do the Dons of the world, and how do the Stacys of the world, and how do the Kims and the Daves and the everybody else's of the world have a cause of action if you don't have 10, 20, 30 grand to hire an attorney? Well, thanks to Don, I read the entirety of the case United States versus Stanley, case that was argued in 1986. And while Justice Antonin Scalia gets my absolute loser of the week, right? Because he's the guy who decided for the majority and basically came up with this doctrine that says that the U.S. can get away with anything and is absolutely incapable of having their immunity pierced. Justice Brennan and Justice O'Connor dissented with the majority in that Supreme Court case. And I want to read you what Justice Brennan wrote. The court confers absolute immunity from money damages on federal officials, military and civilian alike, without consideration of long-standing case law establishing the general rule that such officials are liable for damages caused by their intentional violation of well-established constitutional rights. That is the absolute statement by Justice Brennan. And Justice O'Connor says, no judicially crafted rule should insulate from liability the involuntary and unknowing human experimentation alleged to have occurred in the case. And the case, remember, was actually an outgrowth of the MK case. This was when the CIA and DOD were injecting people with LSD and then trying to figure out what the side effects were. Indeed, as Justice Brennan observes, the United States military played an instrumental role in the criminal prosecution of Nazi officials who experimented with human subjects during the Second World War, and the standards that were the Nuremberg military tribunals developed to judge the behavior of defendants stated that, quote, voluntary consent of human subject is absolutely essential. Did you hear what she said? Is absolutely essential to satisfy moral, ethical, and legal concepts. That was, by the way, upheld in the United States v. Brandt, and it was part of the war criminals trial at the Nuremberg military tribunal under the control of the Law 10 in 1949. If this principle is violated, the very least that society can do is see that victims are compensated as best they can be by the perpetrators. I am prepared to say that our Constitution's promise of due process of law guarantees this much. That is a quote from Sandra Day O'Connor. That's a pretty clear statement, isn't it? So I was sitting there thinking to myself, okay, self, if two well-respected Supreme Court jurists actually come to the same conclusion that any normal human being would come to, which is that no constitutional rights can be abridged because somebody decides to act in an arbitrary and capricious manner and put against their will a human subject in an experiment, then what's going on right now? Now let's break this down really simply. You are part of an experiment. There is no medical or scientific evidence at all that the 6-foot distance has anything to do with the way a healthy population stays healthy in our society. Social distancing is based on droplet studies which have never been associated with actual epidemiologic data. So when Dr. Birx gets up and says, we now think that there's science to justify social distancing, Dr. Birx is lying to you. There is no science justifying it. It's a belief system. And the Supreme Court has been very clear on the difference between science and belief, which means if you are currently living under an order to social distance, you are part of a large epidemiologic experiment. There is no science for this. You are a lab rat. If you are being told, like we're going to here in Virginia tomorrow, where the tyrant in Richmond, Governor Northam, who in near criminal negligence as governor, sought to impose face mask rules on the populace, but just this weekend was seen hugging and rubbing shoulders with individuals at Virginia Beach with no mask and no 6-foot distance. But because he's a tyrant, and because when he was at the Eastern Virginia Medical School, who should be ashamed of him and should sponsor his disbarment from any Virginia medical board, the tyrant that is Governor Northam seeks to impose upon the population of Virginia a face mask ordinance. But here's the problem. There is no scientific evidence that those work, and more importantly, there is very specific evidence that they actually impair the healthy functioning of society. You, if you are asked to wear a face mask, are a lab rat. You are subject to an investigation. Social distancing, face mask wearing, both are experiments. They are experiments promulgated by the Department of Health and Human Services, supported by the Center for Disease Control, and they have no institutional review board authorization, which means they are in violation of the law. And that, my friends, is the reason why I hope millions of people hear what I'm about to say. After the injustice that was given to the Stanley case, and just for your reference, the Stanley in the Stanley case was a veteran of the Korean War and I believe also the Vietnam War. He was subject to all kinds of clinical experimentation, and his life was actually severely damaged. He went on to be a Florida police officer and continued to serve his country, but his country didn't serve him back. And after reading the dissent to the Supreme Court's decision in 1986, Congress passed an interesting law that created a very interesting action you can take. Now, tomorrow, if you download the YouTube version of this video, you are going to see a sample Form 95. It's called Standard Form 95. It's not complicated. Standard Form 95. You go to the U.S. Department of Justice website and you download Standard Form 95. What is Standard Form 95? Here's what it is. It is your pathway to actually find a criminal or a civil liability, define it, and seek redress from the agency of the federal government that harmed you. What's harm? Well, if you lost your job, if you lost customers, if you were physically harmed because you couldn't go to doctor's appointments, you couldn't do the things that you needed to do to maintain your health, the Department of Health and Human Services is actually supposed to get their liability notice from you. And you need to download Form 95, and then you need to fill it out, and you need to send it to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Office of the General Counsel, 200 Independence Avenue Southwest, Washington, D.C., 20201. And in that form, you need to say that the Department of Health and Human Services, through the Center for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease, sought and filed and received a patent starting in 2003, which made the identification, the detection, and detection kits for coronavirus not available to the general population. They, by virtue of that act, by filing that patent, they made it impossible for the public health interest to be served. And that's the beginning of the damage. In 2007, they extended their patent filing, and in that patent filing sought to actually patent the virus, which is against 35 U.S. Code Section 101. In 2013 and to 2018, they worked to use international sources and take the research on gain of function, which was determined by the National Institutes of Health in 2013 to be unethical. They decided to take it offshore and work with the Wuhan Institute of Virology so that they could get around the ethical and legal implications of the work being done here in the United States. And they did that willfully, so that at September 2019, in the publication World at Risk from the World Health Organization, Dr. Anthony Fauci and the members of the committee that actually are affiliated with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation could make a recommendation that a respiratory-based pathogen simulation must be run with no institutional review board review, with no independent physician certifying that their actions were legal, therefore getting them out from the exclusions of Section 50.24 of the 21 Code of Federal Regulations. They decided to start a clinical trial that you have become an unwilling participant in. And the damages that you have, the damages that are your loss of livelihood, your loss of access to health, your loss of access to liberty, the costs associated with your shutdown, the fact that you have not been able to work, the fact that you have not been able to deal with childcare, every one of those facts is now a financial liability under the standard Form 95 submission to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Now here's where it's going to get fun. They're required by law to respond to you. And the best thing about it is there's a time limit on it. They have to respond within 90 to 180 days, depending on whether they get some wiggle room. But here's the other part of that. You have 2 years from the date of the injury, or from the date of the civil claim, or from the date of the crime. You have 2 years to do this filing. But here's what I want you to do. I want you to join me. And starting tomorrow, I want the Office of the General Counsel of the Department of Health and Human Services to be overwhelmed with millions of claims. I want every person who has filed an unemployment claim, I want every one of those people to fill out a Form 95 and send it to the Office of the General Counsel. I want the Department of Health and Human Services to know that their violation of their own rules, which led to the destruction of your life and your livelihood, I want them to know that it comes at a cost. And I want every single one of you, and I want all of the people that you share this video with, to take that form and flood the Office of the General Counsel. I want millions of pieces of paper on their desk, and I want to hear a week from now that the Office of the General Counsel of the Department of Health and Human Services has been overrun with over 30 million. That's my goal. 30 million individual forms of claims for benefits for an illegal clinical trial. And the specifics on the clinical trial, just so you get it right, are you have been forced to an experiment in which you did not give consent. And the experiment was called social distancing and face mask wearing. That's the experiment There is no institutional review board. There is no independent doctor. And it is up to you now to take a stand, because we, the people, have an ability to have our voices heard. Remember in the Stanley case, one courageous veteran stood against the tyranny of the Department of Defense's experimentation with LSD, and stood against the tyranny of the CIA's investigations with LSD. One veteran stood alone, and that got Congress to act in 1986 and 1987. Please understand, ladies and gentlemen, if 1 million of us act, if 30 million of us act, if 100 million of us act, we will be heard, because they have no recourse, because they wrote the rules and they didn't follow them. So the bad news that I started with, you're a lab rat. The bad news is almost. They think you are. And every time you see people social distancing or face mask wearing, that's all part of the lab rat exercise. And remember, the data they want to collect is, did that somehow change the way coronavirus spread? Well, the answer is they'll never know. As it was just reported in the UK, the former director of the World Health Organization was lamenting the fact that we probably won't get to a vaccine because coronavirus, as I said to you a couple weeks ago on this video, is going to burn itself out. Because that's what coronaviruses do. But the bad news is, just because that's a fact does not mean that you can let tyrants like Governor Newsom and Governor Northam and Governor Cuomo and others get away with what they have done. And it doesn't mean that you can let tyrants in the name of public health deprive you of what the Supreme Court found to be fundamental as an absolute guarantee of constitutional liberty. You can do something about it, and tomorrow you'll see a sample form that you can download, you can share, you can use with all of your friends and all your associates, and I want to see 35 million of us standing together and actually sending the bill for this crime to the place that it started, the United States Department of Health and Human Services. It's time that the snake bites back. It's time for the rats to actually eat the cheese. Because this experiment with this action is over. Thanks very much, and share the heck out of this thing. Talk to you next week.